In earlier movies, I've talked about spot colors and duotones and mixed ink swatches, but I need to take a moment to explore a few issues that are particular to printing spot colors. Before I do that, though, I want to deconstruct this document a little bit. I have an image over here and an image over here that I want to go look at. I'll switch to Photoshop first to look at this one. I'll use my application switcher. On the Mac it's Command Tab or Alt Tab on Windows, and I can see in Photoshop I have my image with a spot color in it. It's a regular CMYK image, but I can tell that it has a spot color because in the Channels panel I can see a separate fifth channel called Pantone 361C. Now, I don't want to get into the details about how to make spot color channels in Photoshop. There are plenty of other movies on the lynda.com online training library about how to use Photoshop, but I just want to point out that this has a separate spot channel in here. And in fact, if I turn that off, you can see that it's knocking out the image behind it. Now, I've saved this as a PSD file, and I've imported it into InDesign. Let's go check out Illustrator. I'll switch over to Adobe Illustrator here, and we can see here's our Illustrator graphic, and this graphic right here, this object, has been assigned a color. And if I double-click on it in the Swatches panel, I can see that it's a spot color assigned once more with Pantone 361C. Click OK. We've saved this as an Adobe Illustrator file, could be PDF, I suppose, but I saved it as AI, and let's go back to InDesign, and we can see it on our page, the Photoshop image and the Illustrator image. And both of these use spot colors. We can see that when we import those images into InDesign, at the bottom of the Swatches panel, there's our swatch, the Pantone 361C. It's named exactly the same because InDesign added that when I imported those images. I've created a new mixed ink swatch based on that Pantone color as well, called 30K and 75% PMS 361, and I've applied that mixed ink swatch to this text. Before I go any farther, I want to point out one more time the Ink Manager, which you can find in several places, including in the flyout menu of the Swatches panel. Inside Ink Manager, I want to check this carefully, and I want to turn on Use Standard Lab Value for Spots. That way, I'll get more accurate preview of my color on screen and when I print to a color printer. I could also convert my spots to process colors here by turning on All Spots to Process, or by clicking on the little icon to the left of the name. That changes that color to a process color. But in this case, I don't want to do that. I want to maintain my Pantone color, click OK, and I'll go look at the print dialog box because I want to think about how to print this document. I'll choose Print from the File menu. I don't have a high-end printer here to work with, so I'll just choose my color laser printer. It'll give us the basic idea here. When you're printing to let's say you're printing separations, you would choose separations from the output pane, and then you have some options. For example, you can set up screening if you have special screening to do here. Now let me move this out of the way and talk about what's going on the page. On the graphic on the right, this Illustrator graphic, the Pantone colors are all solid colors, and they're knocking out anything behind them. So I never have to worry about screening here because A, there's no tints in this, it's just all solid, and it's not overlapping any other colors, so there's no screening problems that could happen. The one on the left, this Photoshop image, it's mostly solid Pantone color, but there may be on the edges some tints of the Pantone color that are kind of blurring into the images in the background. But even then, it's probably not going to be enough to worry about screening problems. And the screening problems I'm talking about are moire angle problems, where you have two tints of two different inks, and they're overprinting, and they actually start creating weird, ugly patterns in the tints when you print the halftones on top of each other. Now, over here, with this mixed ink color, we have a tint of the Pantone color and a tint of black. And watch out, we're going to have problems here, because those two tints are right on top of each other. So in the print dialog box, if we're going to be printing this from InDesign, we have to pay attention to screening. And we can see that the process black is printing at a 45-degree angle, and the tints of the Pantone 361 are also printing at 45 degrees. So this is a big problem. We definitely need to change at least one of those so that we get a better effect. Now, what angles do you want to use when you're printing spot colors over each other, or different inks on top of each other? Well, the best answer is check with your printer on what angles they suggest. In general, you want to use 45-degree difference between inks when you can, or 30 degrees when you have to, or if you really have to, then 15 degrees, but not other than 15, 30, or 45. That's why you'll see in the normal CMYK inks, we have 30 degrees between here, and 30 degrees between here, and so on. They're compromises between these tints overlapping. But the Pantone ink is only overlapping with black here, so we need to make a compromise between these two. If we were using a very light colored Pantone ink, you might want to select that and change the angle to, let's say, 0. That way, it would have problems with yellow, but we're not overprinting yellow here, so that's not an issue. But we would have a full 45 degrees between that Pantone color and the black. The problem here is that with this green, it's a little bit too dominant. Our eye will see a 0-degree tint really easily, and so, at least in some situations, 0 is going to be probably too much of a problem. So I would probably change this to, let's say, 15 degrees. Then we have 30 degrees between these two, and my guess is that will work out okay. But again, check with your printer. They're going to have their own opinions about all of this. Now, have you ever printed a proof of your document, and let's say you've used spot colors, maybe put drop shadows on there and so on, and you print a proof to an inkjet printer, and you realize that the result is totally different than what you see on screen? What's going on there? Well, InDesign tends to create these effects with spot colors based on overprinting. And when you print a proof, sometimes the overprinting doesn't kick in, the printer doesn't understand overprinting, especially inkjet printers, and so the effect completely gets lost, and that's just ugly. So if you are printing, let's say, to an inkjet printer, and you're going to be printing not separations, but probably composite RGB or composite CMYK, you might turn on Simulate Overprint. Now, you do not want to do this with a final output at all. One of the big things that happens here is all of your Pantone colors get converted to process colors on the fly. So this is a no-no for final output, but for proofing, it can be very, very handy indeed to simulate the overprint, which is also simulating the transparency. One other thing about transparency issues with spot colors, multiply blending mode works fine, screen typically works just fine, but some of the fancier ones, especially color, saturation, difference, exclusion, those blending modes, you don't want to be using those with spot colors. You get some really cool looking effects on screen, wow, it looks awesome, but it does not print properly at all. It typically converts all of those to process colors along the way. So simple blending modes, common blending modes, fine, go ahead and use them, but not the fancy ones. Now that it's so cheap to print 4-color process color jobs, I find that many fewer people are relying on spot colors these days. But there are still great reasons to use spot colors, including a far wider range of colors and effects than you can achieve by simply mixing cyan, yellow, magenta, and black. And as long as you follow these basic spot color rules, you'll get great results.